Well, welcome back to the Bible Reading Challenge podcast. My name is Aaron Ventura, and this is episode 7 of our summer season through the New Testament. And this is also part 2 in our series on eschatology. And today we are going to try to answer the question, which passages refer to AD70 and which ones refer to the final consummation? Please comment on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay. There are so many passages that speak of Christ's coming in AD 70 because that is the context of the entire New Testament. So there's simply no way I could cover all of them in one episode. So what I want to do is give you 3 categories, or you could think of them like 3 buckets that you can put passages in. And then I'm going to give you some representative examples of passages that go in each of that bucket. Now, if there is a specific passage that you have questions about that I do not address here, please do feel free to email me at aventura@christkirk.com or use the Google form in the show notes, and perhaps I will do an episode on it because I know there are a lot of challenging passages. And for what is going to probably be a 20-30 minute podcast, the amount of hours that I put in to do some research on these things, wrestle with a few of these passages, it was a lot. It took me a lot of time, and that's just this last week, not including the years of study that I've done wrestling with these things. So I don't want to pretend or represent these things as if they are super simple and straightforward, because there are lots of good and godly men who love Jesus but who disagree on these things. So this is one of the reasons why I want to give you these 3 categories or 3 buckets, and I suggest that probably all of you should have these categories in your mind. So let me walk you through what these 3 categories or buckets are. And just so you know, these are categories of confidence that I have the correct interpretation of the passage. Okay, so bucket number 1, these passages were definitely fulfilled in the 1st century. So anything that I put in bucket number 1, I feel like I can argue, give a strong biblical defense for that being fulfilled in the 1st century. So those are AD 70 related passages. Bucket number 2, these passages definitely refer to the consummation, or the end of history, end of the millennium, the time before the eternal state. And same thing, I feel like I can give a good, strong argument and defense for that. And then there's bucket number 3. And these are the passages that I'm pretty sure I can put it in the correct bucket, but I'd like to keep studying before I make any definitive statement on it. And these are passages that if I was going to preach on them, I would need to really go do my research, read a bunch of commentaries on it, and then I may decide I'm actually going to not preach on this passage yet because I don't feel confident in my exegesis and explanation of it. So I have those 3 categories, and I think every Christian should also have those categories as well as they read through the New Testament. However, I think my suspicion is for this audience that most people have way too many passages in bucket number 2, things that refer to the end of all time, that should actually be in bucket number 1, that were fulfilled in the 1st century. And as I go through some of these passages, I will try to point out to you which passages I am in the kind of minority on and which ones there is far more agreement. So let's spend some time working through some of these challenging texts. So bucket number 1, what is in bucket number 1? Passages that were definitely fulfilled in the 1st century. And I'm going to start with, I think, the more easy and straightforward ones. And this is where there is, I think, a lot more agreement. So pretty much all post-mills, I think pretty much most are all a-mill people, and even a lot of pre-mills are going to take the Olivet Discourse, which is Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and then I'm going to argue there's a parallel passage in Luke 17 that helps explain Matthew 24. But if you pull those up, and this is what I actually did. So I pulled up a Microsoft Word document. I made 3 columns, and then I put Matthew 24, Mark 13, and then Luke 21 and Luke 17 in there. And then I just aligned them so that where there is agreement or where they're basically saying the same thing, I can see what the minor differences are. So some authors are going to include more than, so Matthew is longer than Mark. Luke is going to expand on certain things and also not say certain things, but they all are going to share some things in common that can give real illumination to what Jesus said was going to take place within that one generation, within that first century. I should also note that in Matthew 24, which is probably the first place you should start, is Matthew 24, there is debate about where the break is, or if there even is a break between 24 and then Jesus talking possibly about the end of history at the end of Matthew 25. So a lot of people are going to say there is a break in the topic or the time that he's speaking of at verse 36. Saying that at that point, Jesus is now talking about the end of history. Now, let me explain to you why I think that's wrong. There are a few reasons for this, and I should also note here that the section headings in my Bible, the New King James Version that I use, is totally wrong and unhelpful here. And this is the case in a lot of Bibles that add little kind of section headings that tell you what the topic is. So in my New King James, so the people who put this together were futurists. I believe they may have been dispensational or premillennial, and they totally botched some of these sectional divisions, and you can't always trust them. So you just got to remember when Paul wrote his letters, when the Gospels were put together, there weren't these little sectional topical divisions like we have in some of our study Bibles. So you have to not let those always drive your exegesis and interpretation of the passage. So let me explain why I think all of Matthew 24 refers to a first century fulfillment, not just the first 35 verses. The reason is there is a parallel passage in Luke 17. And if you look at the language there, he speaks of Noah and Sodom and Lot, and he uses those as illustrations, and also the flood. You're going to see the same kind of language in 2 Peter 3 as well. And it speaks in Luke 17:30 of the revelation of the Son of Man. So this is the apocalypse, the revelation of the Son of Man. Now, can you think of any time you have a revelation of the Son of Man? Well, I believe this refers to what the entire book of Revelation is talking about. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ, who is the Son of Man. And so because I take Revelation, the first 19 chapters, referring to a first century fulfillment, and then I see Luke and 2 Peter using the same kind of language, this apocalypse, revelation of the Son of Man, I am going to then take the parallel passage in Matthew, which has the same language as Luke here, to refer to a first century fulfillment. And this is the section where it says, 2 women are going to be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. So I don't believe that refers to some kind of future rapture where 2 people are driving in the car and the person riding shotgun is a believer, the person who's driving is an unbeliever, and then suddenly, poof, the believer disappears and all that's there is his clothes. So that whole kind of left behind dispensational idea, I think, is nowhere found in Scripture, like whatsoever. And if you have questions about that, go ahead and email me, and perhaps I'll talk more about it. The other reason that I take all of Matthew 24 to be fulfilled in the first century is that that description I said of this kind of believers and unbelievers at the very end, and some are raptured away. I believe that absolutely contradicts what the rest of the Old Testament prophesies about the Messiah's kingdom, and especially 1 Corinthians 15 and Revelations 20 description of the end of history, which I believe I said in the episode before this, that I believe those passages teach that the entire world, even down to the last man, you could say, is completely Christianized. People are obeying the law of God, and the holy city is full of saints. So I cannot see a future holy city of Jerusalem being full of unbelievers in which suddenly some of them are taken away. So I believe all of Matthew 24, 2 Peter 3, and Luke 17 speaks of a first century fulfillment. So that would be the one possibly controversial piece that not everyone agrees on. I believe even someone like Gary DeMar, who is a partial preterist, holds to a lot of similar things that Pastor Doug, myself, and others do. I think he actually thinks Matthew 24 and 25, all of 25, was a first century fulfillment. And I will tell you now, and I will tell you again later, the end of Matthew 25 for me is in bucket number 3. So I tend to lean towards that being a end of all things history because of the everlasting fire referred to there. But there are some people who take Matthew 25 as being a first century fulfillment as well. So that's something I want to keep looking into. Okay, so I would encourage you to read Matthew 24, read Mark 13, read Luke 17 and 21, the relevant sections there, and then notice what is said in all of them. You are given a very clear timestamp. So you'll find in all of those Gospels, Jesus saying this, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So what I have done is I just went through all 3 of these passages, and I made a list of all these things that are going to take place within that generation. So now I'm going to give you the pretty much extensive, exhaustive list from Jesus' own mouth that he said was going to take place in the first century. And I have 25 things. That's the way that I've broken it out. So here they are. These are all the things that are first century fulfillment. And I would encourage you, because I can't touch every other passage, say in the epistles or some of the other books of the Bible, think about what I'm about to read to you, these 25 things, and if there are similar sounding passages in the New Testament. And that will clue you in as to whether he's talking about first century or thousands and thousands of years off into the future. Okay, here's the 25 things. Number 1, Jesus says, not one stone of the temple would be left upon another. So the temple's going to be destroyed. Number 2, false Christs will come to deceive. Antichrists are going to show up, first century. Number 3, there will be wars and rumors of wars. 4, international warfare between nations and kingdoms. 5, earthquakes in various places. 6, pestilences. 7, famines. 8, fearful sights and great signs from or in heaven. Number 9, the disciples would be persecuted, beaten in synagogues, brought before rulers and kings for a testimony. They'll be in prison. They'll be hated by all nations for the sake of Jesus, and some of them will be killed. And if you think of the book of Acts, it's like, hey, we see all those things happening in the book of Acts. Number 10, many will be offended and start betraying and hating one another. There will be betrayal by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends, and as a result, some will be put to death because of this betrayal. Number 11, lawlessness will abound, and the love of many will grow cold. It reminds me of a similar passage in, I believe, 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy, same language. Number 12, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Not a hair of their head will be lost. This is one of those wonderful passages saying that even though we're going to die, we're not going to die. So Paul, at the end of his life, he knows that he's going to be killed, and yet he says, but Jesus is going to not let a single hair of my head perish or be lost. This is the great hope and promise of the resurrection. Number 13, the gospel of the kingdom would be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Now, if that sounds remarkable to you, this is actually confirmed by Colossians 1:6, which says the same thing. The gospel has gone out to the whole known world at the time, and it's bearing fruit and growing. And then you can discuss the differences. There's two Greek words, different concepts. There's cosmos, so Jesus died for the cosmos, and then there's the world, referring to the oikumene, and that is generally like the whole Roman Empire at the time. So, and that goes back to the book of Daniel, where you had the Assyrians and the Babylonians, then the Medo-Persian kingdom, and then Rome, and then you're going to have the kingdom of Christ. So it's going to say that in the first century, the gospel would be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Number 14, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel would stand in the holy place. So that would require you to go back to Daniel, read those sections, or go back and listen to the podcast that we did on that. Who is the abomination of desolation? What is that? And then number 15, because of this abomination of desolation, people in Judea should flee to the mountains immediately, not even going to grab clothes from the house if they were working in the field. And Jesus also says, pray your flight is not in winter or on the Sabbath. So there's a sense of urgency. When you see that happening, you just better start running. And if you were smart and heard these gospel messages, you would have known ahead of time that you should probably just get out of Jerusalem, get out of Judea altogether. Number 16, Jesus says, these are, quote, days of vengeance. So the days of vengeance were in the first century, in which there will be a great distress in the land. Many will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive to all nations. Number 17, there would be woe upon those who are pregnant and nursing babies. Number 18, here it is, great tribulation. So the Great Tribulation was a first century thing, and he adds this qualifier to it, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. Goes on, things will be so bad that unless God had shortened those days for the sake of the elect, no flesh would be saved. So that Great Tribulation is cut short. But notice also it says that nothing had been so bad since the very beginning of the world. So this was worse than the conditions before even the flood, and God destroyed that world. And so there's a even worse judgment coming. I believe it says in Luke that all the blood of the righteous, from righteous Abel to Zechariah, all the innocent blood that was shed by Jerusalem, that harlot city, that Babylon, destruction is going to be done in that time for all of the sins of the past. So there's something really cataclysmic happening in the first century, a judgment on the whole world at the time, and even for things that were done in the past. So this is distinct from the future final judgment at the great white throne. So we got to remember there are multiple judgments in history. Okay, continuing on, number 19, Jesus says Jerusalem is going to be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And many people, myself included, believe we are still in those times where it's the times of the Gentiles. They're coming into Christ. They're being added to the church. Number 20, more false Christs and false prophets are going to arise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. And they're going to say things like, the Christ has come and he's out in the desert, or he's in the inner rooms. And Jesus says, don't believe them when they say that, because you're gonna see it. It's going to be like a lightning flash in the heavens. So he's saying it's not going to be on earth. This is going to be something that happens in the heavens. And then we're given some of those heavenly signs. So after that tribulation, Jesus says, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall, the powers in the heavens will be shaken, distress of nations on the earth with perplexity, the sea and the waves are going to be roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. And then number 22, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of earth will mourn. 23, and they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And in order to understand this coming on the clouds, you got to remember the passage in Daniel 7, the coming of the Son of Man. Number 24, the elect are to look up at that time and lift their heads because their redemption draws near. So these elect saints, when they see this sign, are supposed to look up and know that their redemption is not going to be thousands of years off. It's going to be right around the corner. And we'll talk about how there was this great harvest, this resurrection, this first fruits resurrection, even in the first century. And then number 25, the Son of Man is going to send his angels to gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. So that was a first century harvest, a gathering in of God's elect from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. Jesus then gives, so that's the 25 things, and then now I'll speak just a little bit about what he talks about after that. So he gives the parable of the fig tree, and then he gives that definitive timestamp. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all 25 of those things that he just said takes place. He then admonishes them to take heed that they be watchful and pray always, that they would be counted worthy to escape some of those tribulations and judgment, that they'd be able to escape all these things and stand before the Son of Man. And that's when he gives the examples of Noah and Sodom and Lot. And that's why I take all of Matthew 24 to refer to the first century. Okay, let me give you a few other just examples that came to mind from the New Testament that have a first century fulfillment, just so you have some examples of this. 1 Corinthians 7:30-31, where Paul says, "But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away." So in the first century, Paul says the schema, the form of that present world was about to pass away, and it did. So in a very real sense, we're living in a different form of the world than Paul did in the first century. I mentioned 2 Peter 3 earlier, which is really one of the most challenging passages, and for a lot of my life, this was in category 3. What really helped me was reading Peter Leithart's commentary on 2 Peter. It's called The Promise of His Appearing, and he gives a number of, I think, what he calls knockdown arguments for why this was a first century fulfillment. And if you want me to, email me, and maybe I'll just do a whole episode walking through some of those arguments, because I believe you're going to be reading 2 Peter very soon, if not this week, then next week. And there are some really challenging things there. So I believe that 2 Peter 3 is a first century judgment and coming of Christ, not the final coming. John Owen is someone else who held to this view, but this is a minority view. So not everyone who's a post-mill or preterist takes 2 Peter 3 in a preteristic fashion. So a lot of people take 2 Peter 3 as prophesying the future and final judgment. I do not. So I'm in the minority on that. Okay. What about those passages in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? Let me try to answer this. So there are basically 4 chapters to debate, and I'll just tell you which category I put those chapters in, and you can read them for yourself. So 1 Thessalonians 4, I place in category 2 as something that takes place at the end of history. And this is something that I had to go back and forth on. I had to kind of map it out and look more closely at it in my own study before I came to this conclusion. And that is, I don't think this can refer to the first century, because if everyone was caught up into heaven in the clouds, then there would have been 0 Christians left after that. So even though there was a harvest, a great resurrection, and I believe ascension up into heaven in the first century, I don't think 1 Thessalonians 4 is talking about that. I think it's talking about the very end of history. And then the rest, 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 Thessalonians 2, 2 Thessalonians 3, I do put in category 1 as taking place in the first century. So I believe all those have a first century fulfillment. And if you read the language of those chapters and compare with what Jesus is talking about in the Olivet Discourse, I think you also may be persuaded that those are clear first century fulfillments. So just to summarize, if you want to understand New Testament eschatology, you have to see that Scripture speaks of multiple resurrections. There are multiple resurrections in history. There are multiple judgments in history, judgments even of works, of what people have done. There are multiple comings or parousias of Christ. And this was even built into the festivals and feast days of the Old Covenant, all of which connect to Christ's resurrection as first fruits. The Old Testament saints would be the barley harvest in the first century, and then there would be a future ingathering of all the crops, all the Gentiles and nations, and that was typified by the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. So just walking through their calendar, you can actually see there are patterns here that God is teaching us from. So the first fruits barley offering happens in the spring, so the green. And then there's the wheat harvest 50 days later at Pentecost. And so when you read about Pentecost in Acts 2, there's a whole bunch of theology that goes into what is happening there, and specifically the wheat harvest. And then after that, there's the celebration of all the crops coming in. This would include the grapes or the wine, the vineyard harvest, which takes place in the fall. And if you read other passages in Scripture like 1 Corinthians 15, Paul actually says that you are a fool if you don't see that the harvest pattern of sowing and reaping teaches you the resurrection of the dead. He says, you're a fool. Don't you know that something must die and go into the ground and then come up glorified with a different kind of body? There's continuity between the seed, and then there's some kind of discontinuity where it is sown in dishonor, but it's raised in glory. And this is all connected to sowing and reaping and even the feast days of the Old Testament. So I'll probably talk more about this when we get into the actual exposition of the book of Revelation. Another place you'll see this is in James 5, verses 7 and 8. Notice the harvesting language. James says this, "Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." So anytime you see that language, it's at hand, it's coming quickly, it's soon to happen. I take those words very seriously, very literally, to refer to something that was happening at that time. So in the time that James was writing this, the coming of the Lord was right there. It was at hand. Another place you could look is Matthew 16, verses 27 to 28, where Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he tells them this, "For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works." Now, if I were to just stop there, you'd probably think, I don't know, that sounds like the end of all things, the end of history, the final judgment. Except that, if you read the next verse, Jesus says this, "Assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And I believe that once again refers to Daniel 7, the Son of Man coming in glory in his kingdom. So Jesus said that some, not all of his disciples, that some of them would not see death until they see him, the Son of Man, coming in his kingdom. So there was a judgment according to works. He would reward each man according to his works and come in glory, a glory that the apostles witnessed. And that was going to take place in these own disciples' lifetime before they tasted death. Okay, so there's tons more texts like this, and do please feel free to email me, message me if there's a specific passage that you have questions about. But let me run through briefly buckets number 2 and 3, what I have in those. So bucket number 2, category 2, these are passages that I believe definitely refer to the consummation or the end of the millennium, the period before the eternal state. I already mentioned 1 Thessalonians 4. Others would include Revelation 20, verse 7 through Revelation 22, 5. And this describes how this present age is going to end. So Satan will be unbound, he'll be destroyed. There's the second death, the second resurrection that takes place. There's the final judgment of the great white throne. Death and Hades are cast into the lake of fire, and the saints enter into the new heavens and new earth, which are now consummated. And those are described in chapters 21 and 22. Another place that I would go to that points to the very end of all things is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20 to 28. Another place would be in the book of Acts, and if you piece together Acts 1, verse 11 with Acts 3, 20 to 21, you should conclude that Jesus is going to descend bodily, the angel says, just as the disciples saw him ascend, so also one day he will descend bodily. But that won't happen until the restoration of all things. You can compare in Acts 3. Other passages that speak of the end, or at least the conditions that there will be on the earth at the very end, would be Daniel 2, so the stone that grows into this great mountain, which represents the kingdom of God. Psalm 2, Psalm 72, Psalm 110, Genesis 15, basically all the promises and prophecies about the kingdom of Christ extending to all the nations, so that Abraham's children are truly more numerous than the stars, more numerous than the sand. So those must be fulfilled prior to Christ's final coming. Okay, bucket number 3, things that I'm pretty sure I can put it in the correct bucket, but I'd like to keep studying. I mentioned Matthew 25, 31 to 46. There are parts of this that might refer to a first century judgment, but generally I put this in category 2 right now. One passage that might surprise you is actually Romans 8, verses 18 to 23. So it speaks of the whole creation groaning with birth pangs. And it says, together until now. And the question is, so the now, when Paul is writing that, would have been the first century. So if creation has been groaning for all this time, from the beginning, for those thousands of years until now, it seems to imply to me that perhaps it's ready to give birth to something new. And we saw in Isaiah 65, you see this in 2 Peter 3, that the new heavens and new earth began with Christ in the first century, and it's going to be progressively fulfilled till it's finally consummated at the end of history. And so my question is, what exactly in Romans 8 is it speaking about? It possibly could refer to a first century resurrection and revelation of the sons of God then, but it also could refer to a future resurrection. And part of the question is, in what sense is the creation that you and I are living in right now in 2021 still in bondage or not? So we know that there's still thorns and thistles, but we also know that Isaiah speaks of these days where there's going to be great fruitfulness on the land. If you look at the blessings and curses in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, one of the blessings of covenant keeping is that God is actually going to make it so there's no miscarriages, there's fruitfulness, there's even no death and no sickness on people. And so you're going to see those conditions, I think, more and more fulfilled as history goes on, to the point that you get to the conditions described in Isaiah 65 and 66, with the one exception that there will still be death, which Jesus is going to come back to personally destroy and throw into the lake of fire. So, however, currently I would put that in bucket 2 as referring to the end of all things, but I think I'd like to look more into that, and I might put parts of it into bucket number 1. We'll see. All right, I'm going to stop there for now. If you have questions, remember you can always email me at aventura@christkirk.com. These are really challenging things. You have some really good questions, and we're going to continue on in this series of eschatology, wrestling with it. So until next time, keep on reading.